All right, Psalm 52. Let's call this one Cleanse Me of the Dog, which is really a play on words, understanding that the Bible often speaks negatively of the downside of a dog's character, comparing it to people when we have given up our humanity and simply begun to chase our appetite, something that dogs are known to do. But in this chapter, that dog is going to be represented by a man named Dog, one who assisted Saul in carrying out an atrocity by killing a good number of priests when they stood up, or at least when one of them stood up for David as he fled Saul. And so understanding that, this psalm is going to follow the similar structure we saw in the past too, where the who is going to come in the form of, this time, Dog the Edomite, who David is going to ask for God for the what. And the what is what God is going to do in response to Dog, a man who, instead of feeling bad about the things that he's done, like David in the previous Psalm 51, is actually kind of proud of what he's been able to get away with. And the how is going to come in the form of how, not only, once again, David is going to respond to the way that God is going to deal with Dog, but the way that the people in general will respond to the way in which God is going to deal with Dog. In this psalm that begins, "Why do you boast of evil, O mighty man? The steadfast love of God endures all the day. Your tongue plots destruction. Like a sharp razor, you worker of deceit. You love evil more than good, and lying more than speaking what is right. You love all words that devour, O deceitful tongue," as he's going to go on to describe God's response. Verse 5, "But God will break you down forever. He will snatch and tear you from your tent. He will uproot you from the land of the living," as the rest of the chapter will go on to describe the way in which the people collectively will fear after they saw what God did to Dog. But it's also going to talk about David, and his response isn't going to be all that different, because he is going to talk about the way in which he is going to choose to be planted or rooted in the house of God as a green olive tree. Understanding that Dog's response to his sins is very different from David's response in Psalm 51, as we might have already mentioned, recalling a theme that we have talked about before, and that is in this life, especially in our relationship with God, insofar as we refuse to set an example, we run the risk of eventually becoming the example. Understanding that David set an example of what genuine contrition and repentance looked like in Psalm 51, but in Psalm 52, Dog was the kind of man who had outwardly become proud of what he was able to get away with. Once again, in verse 1, "Why do you boast of evil, O mighty man?" Quite possibly giving us another perspective on the dangers of denial, something we mentioned before and also mentioned in the last chapter. In this circumstance, to the degree we are in denial about the way in which the things we're doing are actually harming other people, we may actually be out of touch with the degree to which God is still hearing their prayers for either vindication or, even worse, vengeance against us, which is not all that different than something Paul is going to warn about in Philippians when he says, regarding those he is likened to dogs in verse 2 of chapter 3, he's going to say in verse 19 of that same chapter, their end is destruction, their God is their belly, and they glory in their shame, sounding awfully similar to what we saw in Dog in verse 1 of Psalm 52, where he was actually proud and boasting of the evil that he was able to get away with. He didn't seem the least bit interested in having God help him set an example of what genuine contrition actually looked like. But in the process, didn't realize the ways in which the pain he was causing those around him was moving God closer and closer to making him an example of why contrition matters.